The port of Lorient, Brittany, on the southwest coast of France. Today, a peaceful haven. During World War II, these concrete pens housed one of the most deadly military machines ever created, the Unterseeboot, the German U-boat. From here, U-boats sailed to every corner of the world, wreaking havoc and destruction. Their prime objective, sinking merchant shipping in the Atlantic. U-boats were active from the first day of the war to the last. They posed the greatest threat of all to Allied victory in World War II. The central control room of a Type 7C U-boat, the most prolific of all U-boats. 650 were built. This is the only fully equipped example remaining today. Inside this deadly fighting machine, 44 crew members lived alongside their weapons of war for days on end in cramped and often squalid conditions. 40,000 men went to war in these machines in World War II. 30,000 were to die in their iron coffins. They suffered the highest mortality rate of any fighting unit in the history of war. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill later wrote, "The threat the U-boats posed in the Atlantic was the only thing that ever really frightened me during the war. On their defeat hung the outcome of World War II."
The Battle of the Atlantic was unique in terms of naval operations. What it really was a 6-year struggle for control of the sea lines of communications between North America and Great Britain.
This is the man who created and directed Germany's U-boat fleet in World War II. Admiral Karl Dönitz believed that Britain could be defeated by severing those lines of communication. His U-boats would do that by sinking the vessels that brought the vital supplies on which Britain, an island nation, depended for her survival. This was a war about tonnage.
Dönitz, the German submarine commander, believed it was really the only way of bringing Britain to its knees. To start with, it was just a question of sinking as much as it possibly could. Dönitz and his statisticians came to the conclusion that by sinking about 600,000 tons of ships a month, and that works out at roughly 150 ships a month, they could probably cut the British supply line.
After World War I, the German Navy effectively ceased to exist. They had only begun to rebuild the Navy in the 30s, once Hitler came to power. But at the time war broke out, they really lacked anything like the kind of resources necessary to fight a war with Great Britain. Dönitz had said, if we have war with Britain, give me 300 U-boats and I'll be able to beat her. When war broke out, he had 57 boats.
These U-boats were already deployed in waters around Britain. It was Dönitz's first move towards severing those vital supply lines with North America. The threat of war hung heavily over Britain, and Americans living there were urged to return home. On September 3rd, 1939, a few hours before the British declared war on Germany, a passenger ship, the Athenia, sailed from Liverpool for North America. One of the last passengers to board was Kathleen Scher.
I didn't want to leave England. I hated the prospect of the thought that we were going to be in another world war, and yet it seemed inevitable that it was coming.
The Athenia's 1,400 passengers were unaware a U-boat was stalking their liner along the coast of Ireland. Its commander was Fritz Julius Lemp. International rules of engagement forbade him from sinking a civilian ship without first allowing those on board to take to the lifeboats. This ruling did not apply to enemy warships.
He thought that there were camouflage cannon on the ship, and therefore assumed he had a troop ship in front of him. And as a result, he thought an attack was justified.
I was at dinner. I had been invited by a ship's officer to sit at his table.
I wanted to experience the first torpedo attack of the war for real. The first shot came smoothly out of the tube, and after a short while came the detonation.
There was this incredible, absolutely incredible explosion. Everything went pitch black, a lot of screaming, a lot of yelling.
Only when we tuned into the merchant shipping frequency in the radio room and received the distress call did we realize that it was the Athenia with 1,400 passengers on board. But by then it was too late.
Ships responded to the Athenia's SOS messages. Kathleen was in an open lifeboat for 9 hours before being rescued.
I remember watching the Athenia turn turtle, and this great hulk rose up into the air and then went down.
Kathleen was lucky. 118 passengers perished, 28 were US citizens. There was international outrage as survivors disembarked in North America. When Lemp returned to Germany, he was secretly ordered to forge his patrol log, removing any reference to the Athenia. This defied every naval convention.
Lemp handwrote 2 pages, making the changes. Then I typed out these notes, and they were added to the official war diary. After that, the whole crew was assembled and put under the strictest oath. It even went as far as forbidding us to reveal anything with a gesture or facial expression. It was also very depressing that the rest of the world knew the truth, but we had to lie about it.
Germany's Minister of Propaganda, Goebbels, blamed Churchill for the sinking of the Athenia, a British plot, he claimed, to lure the United States into the war. In London, reaction to the Athenia tragedy was immediate. Convoying, a system pioneered by the British in World War I, was introduced, in which merchant ships traveled together under armed naval escort. These escorts only operated for 200 miles out into the Atlantic, initially the limit of the U-boat threat. But the Royal Navy were unprepared. They had few escort ships. Also, the Admiralty were dangerously dependent on a system for detecting submarines known as ASDIC. This was an early sonar device, which still lacked range and accuracy. One escort captain who served in the Atlantic right through the war and sank 3 U-boats was Sir Robert Atkinson.
In the early days, we had very little equipment, little training, great enthusiasm, but I would say that is about all. The Germans were much more prepared than we were. We were defending rather than attacking. They had the initiative. We had very untrained merchant seamen, very fine men, but they were not accustomed to convoy duty.
Air protection for the convoys against U-boat attacks was the responsibility of RAF Coastal Command. They were also ill-equipped.
The experience of the First World War was that U-boats were very reluctant to attack any ship or convoy which had air cover. So everything possible was used to give cover to shipping approaching these shores. Such aircraft as we had no means of searching for U-boats other than the pilot side. They had no reasonable navigation facilities, and they had no means of attacking the U-boat if they found one.
As Britain faced the realities of a major war and began to build up its fighting resources, one man early on was looking to a distant shore for help in the conflict. Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty at the beginning of the war, was already developing relationships with the USA and its president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. He wanted to help his British allies, but faced opposition.
There was a very strong isolationist feeling. It developed partly because of World War I, where there was a group that felt that we had no business entering in the European war. Nevertheless, we did get into it. In World War II, this group was even stronger, and it had control of Congress. It was not a political thing. It was an internal feeling that the war in Europe is not our war, and we should let them fight it out and not involve ourselves.
I am wishing for the avoidance for my country of the heartbreak that can be America's only reward for participation in another European mess.
Roosevelt had to go forward very, very gradually, never announcing a major change of policy, but simply moving forward step by step in the way of help over armaments and other supplies, and he moved with great circumspection.
His first step was to revise America's Neutrality Act in late 1939, which ended a US embargo on supplying arms to the warring factions. It now allowed trade with them all on a cash-and-carry basis. In reality, this was designed to favor Britain and France because they had control of the sea lanes to America. It was this broad expanse of water along Canada's eastern seaboard that became the main assembly point for getting those vital American goods to Britain. Canadian support for Britain's fight against Hitler had been absolute from day one of the war, and the deep water port of Halifax, Nova Scotia, was of critical importance.
It was the central port on the Atlantic coast from which convoys were formed up for the long trek across the treacherous Atlantic to Great Britain. The term escort can apply either to the individual warship or to a screen consisting of a number of warships. And the principle of convoy protection was really the safe and timely arrival of the convoy. And that means that the escort would really not want to leave that convoy to go chasing after submarines. And that's why quite frequently escort commanders did not have a high number of submarine kills, because their duty was to press the submarine down, that is, keep it underwater where it was out of contact with the convoy, moving more slowly. It was not the submarines killed which was important for the escort. It was the amount of shipping safely transported across the ocean.
This was the U-boat that terrorized those North Atlantic convoys, the Type 7C. A submersible rather than a submarine, it traveled on the surface for 90% of the time. With a maximum speed of over 17 knots from its twin diesel engines, it could outpace many of the defending escort ships. But when it submerged and became dependent on its electric motors for propulsion, its speed was halved.
The Type 7C was that which Dönitz personally preferred because they were most suited for convoy battles in the North Atlantic. They were very maneuverable, especially underwater, and that was something that Dönitz considered very important. They would spend a patrol of perhaps 4 to 5 weeks in the North Atlantic, engaged in convoy operations. The commanders of Type 7Cs tended to be younger men, and the Type 7s themselves embodied the virtues of younger commanders. More energetic, more prone to the offensive, greater optimism. All these are reflected in the use of the Type 7C.
The Type 7C brought immediate success, and the era of the U-boat aces began. Only 2 weeks into the war, Otto Schuart sank the British carrier Courageous. 500 died. 3 weeks later, Gunther Prien and his crew, in a daring raid against the British Grand Fleet moored at Scapa Flow, sank the battleship Royal Oak. 800 died. It was a propaganda coup. Prien and his men were the toast of Germany. In Berlin, they were awarded Iron Crosses, and Prien addressed the nation.
Wir haben uns durchgemogelt durch die Überwachung und waren plötzlich drin. Drin im Hafen von Scapa Flow, wie im Hafen der englischen Seemacht.
Where Ace Prien led, others followed. The most celebrated U-boat commander of all, the Tonnage King, was Otto Kretschmer. He sank 38 Allied ships.
My father had been an officer in World War I. As boys, my brother and myself were taught that the most important thing for a man in Germany is a high sense of duty. Not only normal duty, but also everything beyond the normal call of duty.
Kretschmer had trained in the 1930s and learned the orthodox tactics for launching a U-boat attack. This meant firing a spread of 3 torpedoes into the convoy from outside at a distance. Practical experience taught him there was a more effective method of attack. He devised his own close form of engagement, taking his U-boat inside the convoy. He first tested it on a training exercise.
I tried out my new tactics, going past the escorts, very close to the target, and firing a torpedo at point-blank range, and not a spread from outside. And these escorts at the training establishment, they were so clever. They knew everything, how to defend a target and against submarine attack. If I succeeded with them, I shall succeed in the Atlantic against enemy escorts who have come out across the Atlantic maybe and are in stress and strain.
Hiding beneath the surface by day, Kretschmer would launch his torpedo attacks on the surface at night. With the cover of darkness and firing his torpedoes close into the target, he was harder to locate. He would carefully select the most valuable victims and apply his philosophy of 1 torpedo, 1 ship. Volmar Koenig served under the command of Kretschmer in his boat U-99 and witnessed firsthand the ace in action.
Lieutenant Commander Kretschmer was very intelligent and shrewd. He had developed the tactics of going into the convoy on the surface to the utmost. You have to be very, very cold-blooded to do this. All the lights on the burning tankers and searchlights, and you stay on the surface. You don't dodge. That's very important. And he did this to perfection.
Kretschmer became a national hero, and the army even wrote a march in his honor.
They called it Kretschmer March, and it was attended to me at the ceremony. I had to make a speech, which I never liked to do, speech of thanks, and gave to the regimental commander a life belt of the tanker Conch, which I had just sank in the Atlantic.
It was the heyday of the aces. Between June and August 1940, a handful of U-boats sank over 150 Allied merchant ships. The German occupation of France, after its surrender in June 1940, had transformed the U-boat war. Dönitz was now able to establish bases along the southwest coast of France, giving his U-boats ready access to the Atlantic convoy lanes. He set up his operational headquarters in this chateau, close to the port of Lorient, where he could watch his U-boats come and go. From this underground bunker, he personally directed all operations. Hans Fuhrmann was his adjutant.
While I was there, the biggest problem was the number of U-boats. We only had about 40 to 50 U-boats. That was quite a lot, but of those U-boats, a third were always in transit, going out or coming back. A third would be lying in dock for repairs and refitting, and only a third were really out there in the Atlantic trying to attack the enemy.
If the number of operational boats was critical to the success of Dönitz's Atlantic offensive, so were the crews that manned them. The majority were volunteers, intensively trained and attracted to an elite service where pay was double that of the regular Navy.
Dönitz once described a U-boat crew as a community bound by fate. Any one failure, any one failing could mean death for all 50 men. Therefore, a crew felt very much bound to each other and loyalty to each other in a sense that I don't think any other warship represents. Over 50% of the U-boat crews came from central Germany, where industry had taken hold in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Well over half the U-boat crews had come from the metalworking fields of industry to the German Navy, which meant that they were used to dealing with tubes, pipes, electricity, various forms of metal working and metal shaping, all of which were invaluable skills aboard a naval vessel. These were working class kids.
They were proud of their success. Returning from patrol, they would fly a pennant for each ship sunk. By the end of 1940, they had sunk 1/5 of Britain's merchant fleet. They called it the happy time. The ambition of every captain was to sink 100,000 tons of shipping and gain a Knight's Cross.
What was important to us, whether we had a good skipper or not, it could mean life or death. Fortunate enough to sail under a good skipper. He was a very reasonable man, he was aggressive and yet cautious. He didn't take any unnecessary chances, and he was only 23 years old. Always ceremonies when we left, and there were ceremonies when we returned. Of course, we slowly approached the pier, and there were lots of people standing on the pier, welcome us. The base commander came, and the officers attended and officially welcome us back from a mission. If a captain had Halsschmerzen, that meant that he had a sore throat, and he was going to decorate his throat with a Knight's Cross. And of course, in the process of doing so, he might take some more chances that the crew wasn't always all that enthusiastic about. And the band always played a certain song, and we liked it very much. We were singing, "Now we dive into the foaming beer, because 518 got its ass on the pier." Later on, much later on, when I came to the United States, I found out that that song was Stars and Stripes Forever. Well, of course, when we got ashore, the drinks and the beer in particular tasted very good because there was no drinking on the submarine. And of course, there were the pleasures of the flesh. They loaded us into a bus and took us to the next town and led us out near the bordellos that were there, and we frequented the prostitutes and make up for lost time. Didn't take us long to catch up, however. We had our own special train that ran from the western coast of France all the way back to Germany, to Hamburg, and it was a very comfortable train. That was one of those little privileges that we had.
The relationship between Admiral Dönitz and his men in the U-Waffe, or the submarine service, can perhaps best be described as personal. He identified his submarines as his submarines and his men as his men. He made a point of personal contact with his commanding officers. He knew the crews. He epitomized for them what it meant to be a submariner and a member of a very special elite crew.
Kaplan Hofmeister, meiner Mutter das U-Boot-Kriegsabzeichen zu erreichen. Kämpfen heißt opfern und siegen. Der Kampf geht weiter.
The basis of Dönitz's philosophy was an idea which had started very late in World War I. The idea was to use not single submarines, but submarines in groups. Submarine command normally had no aircraft for reconnaissance. The submarines had to reconnoiter themselves.
The U-boats were positioned in the Atlantic and so-called reconnaissance lines. But there were several U-boats stationed at various points within a particular area where they could keep a watchful eye on the traffic flow, and when a U-boat sighted a convoy, it then sent a radio signal giving the precise coordinates of the convoy, how many knots it was doing and how many ships there were. Then all the other U-boats would mount a combined attack on the convoy, and we call that the Wolf Pack strategy. U-boats never operated alone. Rather, 5, 6 or 7 boats, if available, would pounce on the convoy simultaneously.
It was first called group tactics. But at the end of the year 1939, I got into a train and entered the restaurant car. I saw Dönitz with some other officers sitting there for dinner. Dönitz said the submarine force really needed a slogan. And then he took his table napkin and put down some words. U-Boote sind die Wölfe zur See, angreifen, reißen, versenken. U-boats are the wolves at sea, attack, tear, sink.
A submarine is a killing machine, and it's a weapon. And the people serving on a submarine are eager for success. You spot the ship, you spot the convoy, and you fire the torpedo, and you look at the stopwatch and say, well, by now it should have hit the torpedo. Suddenly it gives a big bang and say, well, it's a hit. And you are proud of success, and you don't think of the poor people. You don't think so. And you don't see the subject you are shooting at. Perhaps the captain does, to the periscope, or the people on the bridge if you are fighting above the surface. It's impersonal. It's a fighting machine, and you are part of the machine, a little wheel. And you don't think of these consequences. It might be bad, but that's the way it is.
The merchant seamen who sailed out from Liverpool and other British ports were the unsung heroes of the Battle of the Atlantic. Drawn from all nationalities, they put their lives on the line to transport the vital supplies from North America. 30,000 paid the ultimate price.
Well, to be torpedoed is a very horrifying experience. Now, depending on what type of merchant ship you're on, if you're loaded with explosives and you're hit with a torpedo, there's one big explosion. The ship disintegrates, and there's usually no survivors. If you're on a tanker, particularly loaded with aviation gas or high-octane gas, there's a big ball of flame after being struck with a torpedo, just conflagration. And again, there's very, very few survivors.
I always slept with my clothes on. I always had my boots where I could grab them. I always had my life jacket. Most of the time slept with it, even washed with it. When I used to do the dishes, I used to take them out on the deck and lay them on the water, pans of water on the hatch, top of the hatch, and wash them there. And they used to say, why are you doing that? And I used to say, well, if we get hit, I want to be outside where I won't get jammed.
We were in the part of the ship which is almost impossible to escape from under conditions of being torpedoed. The engine, of course, being the focal point of any torpedo attack, being the most vulnerable part of a ship in order to disable it. We felt very keenly our exposure down there. Really, we felt that if we were ever torpedoed on watch, we really didn't have a chance to escape.
I've seen many, many ships sunk. In fact, we're so close to some of them, sometimes you'd feel the heat from them. And these men were in the water, and oily water, and crude oil, and black bunker, and we were not allowed to stop to pick up survivors. That was a very strict rule the Navy made, that you were not to stop under any circumstances. So it's pretty bad when you know there's people in the water there hollering for help. There's not a blessed thing you can do about it.
There's one ship designated to pick up survivors. And if that ship found you before you died exposed from exposure, you were probably saved. If not, you're just another casualty in the North Atlantic.
In the heart of London, at Churchill's secret underground headquarters, the crippling loss of ships, supplies and lives was painfully apparent. There was a desperate need for additional escort ships to help protect the convoys. One of Churchill's first acts as Prime Minister was to ask Roosevelt for assistance. A deal was finally struck. In return for leases on 8 Caribbean islands, Britain got 50 Great War American destroyers. An unequal exchange, many said. The ships were in poor shape, But for the first time, it meant an open, official US commitment to Britain's cause. 6 months later, Roosevelt came to the rescue in decisive manner when Britain no longer had the cash to pay for its American supplies.
Roosevelt had to come up with a different means of helping his ally, Winston Churchill, and it was the Lend-Lease Bill. Now, this was an act whereby the United States agreed to give Britain all it needed in raw materials, weapons, fuel, and food in order to keep that island nation alive. And the Lend-Lease Bill was made palatable to many by the wonderful image that was created by President Franklin Roosevelt when he said, "It is like a man whose neighbor's house is on fire and he lends him his garden hose."
The Lend-Lease Bill meant Britain could draw on American war supplies without having to pay cash. Above all, it guaranteed a supply of cargo vessels to challenge Dönitz's declared goal of sinking Allied merchant ships more rapidly than they could be replaced. In the spring of 1941, the U-boat arm suffered one of its first major setbacks. 2 of Dönitz's greatest aces, Schepke and Prien, set out for the last time. Their boats were sunk in the Atlantic and neither commander survived. On the same patrol, Otto Kretschmer's boat was mortally damaged by the British destroyer HMS Walker and its crew forced into the water. Volmar Koenig was there.
And there I was, and clinging to this scrambling net. But I was too numb to do anything, so the British sailors came over the side, down the net, and put me up to the deck.
Of course, I had a life jacket on, and the mermaids couldn't pull me down. I recovered myself on the surface again and followed my crew, the rest of my crew, which was taken up out of the water by HMS Walker.
Kretschmer's capture ended the era of the individual aces and marked a change in the direction of the U-boat war. Henceforward, Dönitz switched almost entirely to group tactics, wolf packs operating further and further out into the mid-Atlantic. His operational base in France was also expanding. Construction of the huge U-boat pens at Lorient was underway. With their massive reinforced concrete walls, they provided a secure haven against British bombing raids. And from shipyards all over Germany poured the boats to fill them. In 1941, Dönitz's fleet doubled, but expansion brought problems.
As the U-boat fleet expanded so dramatically from 1940 to 1942, Dönitz had to cut corners in training his commanders, in training his crews. He knew that in order to provide the strongest possible force to fight the convoy battles in the North Atlantic, he had to compromise on their training. Younger, less experienced, less well-trained commanders might not possess the kind of insight into how to attack a convoy. To compensate for that shortcoming, Dönitz assumed on himself the need to control operations, to direct a convoy battle from his headquarters.
But one of the prime characteristics of the direction of the submarine war in the Battle of the Atlantic was radio communications. And Admiral Dönitz would constantly have radio contact with his ships. He was conducting war on their behalf, directing them towards certain convoys, directing them towards certain task groups, demanding that they submit weather reports, whatever the case might be. In fact, he was known to have sent a lot of signals which, from a purely operational tactical point of view, were utterly superfluous. And sometimes it seems as though he himself really didn't understand the risks he was asking his commanders to undertake. Frequently, in replying to these signals, the submariners were exposing themselves needlessly to danger.
British naval intelligence knew in World War I everything about the position of German U-boats, because also of the radio chatter. They took bearings, they knew where they were.
Locating the position of the enemy by tuning into his radio signals had been written about in an obscure English publication in 1931. Kretschmer had discovered this book during his midshipman training and not forgotten its lessons.
Some of the chapters gave me so much information about submarine war. First of all, not to use a radio, to keep radio silence, and know how efficient British naval intelligence was.
In a leafy suburb 50 miles north of London lay hidden one of the most powerful and secret weapons of World War II, the British government's communications headquarters at Bletchley Park. Their highest priority was to crack the German naval code. This machine lay at the heart of that code. Every U-boat had one. It ciphered and deciphered all the secret messages that passed between Dönitz and his U-boats. It was considered impregnable. The British called it Enigma.
The German cryptologists had taken their steps to protect their messages with the very invention of the Enigma cipher system. The number of combinations was, it has recently been calculated, greater than the number of atoms in the known universe, and would have taken many more eons than the universe has been in existence to come up with a possible correct answer.
Inside this Edwardian mansion, the Bletchley Park codebreakers began the seemingly impossible task of trying to break the Enigma cipher system. At the beginning of the war, 70 people worked here. That number was to grow to 12,000.
The people at Bletchley Park were mostly intellectuals. Many of them were expert chess players, mathematicians, linguists, and a few professional cryptographers. It's important to understand that the breaking of the German naval enigma was a much more difficult problem than the breaking of the German Air Force or Army enigma. The reason was that the German naval enigma was set up by keying books, which told you which order the rotors should be put in and where their starting positions were and a number of the other keying variables. It wasn't possible, really, to crack the enigma without the knowledge of the keying variables organized in this book. In the middle of 1941, Harry Hinsley, a young undergraduate, had the idea that it might be possible to capture some of the keying books from some German weather ships, which were isolated to the northeast of Iceland.
The Germans were keeping weather trawlers up among the icebergs. We knew their positions. And most important of all, though this was a guess on my part, that they carried the Enigma. And with that information, the Admiralty went and captured a trawler. It was a stroke of fortune that the Germans had the Enigma in those little ships, little fishing ships. It was unbelievable. I couldn't believe my eyes when I thought, well, they've got the Enigma. I could hardly believe myself. But they had. That was an amazing, amazing stroke of luck.
Further treasures were about to be recovered from the Atlantic to help the codebreakers crack the Enigma system. U-110, under the command of Fritz Julius Lemp, who sank the Athenia on the first day of the war, was blown to the surface by a Royal Navy escort group. For David Baum, it was to be the most important day of his life.
Well, I was the sub-lieutenant, aged 20, in HMS Bulldog, which was the leader of a third escort group in the Atlantic. We were there, and Brescia and the HMS Broadway, an old American destroyer which had been given to us. We all opened fire with all our guns on U-110. The object being to rattle the crew, to get them to abandon ship.
Lemp saw a destroyer clearing directly towards us. One of the destroyers was the Bulldog, and the other one was the Broadway. At the last moment, the Broadway got an order from the Bulldog to abort the ramming.
Abzusetzen. Captain Baker Cresswell, captain of Bulldog, shouted through the megaphone, don't ram, because he wanted to preserve U-110 and just stop Broadway from ramming her.
Aborting the ramming at the last minute was fatal for us, because Lemp had assumed that they would cut us in half, so everyone had to get out. And in this situation, he of course shouted down, "Get out, out, out!" And when we radio operators asked, "What about the secret papers and so on?" he said, "Leave it all in there, get out, out, out." He tried to save the life of every single man. When we were in the water and the boat didn't sink, then it was too late to do anything about it.
We could see Obrisha was told to pick up all survivors. They picked up all the German crew, dropped them down below immediately, so they couldn't see what was going on. And my captain ordered a way-armed boarding party and told me to take charge of it.
They rowed over to the stricken sub, with David at the helm, not knowing whether demolition charges had been set or German crew members were still on board. David courageously went down inside the submarine ahead of his team.
The hatch going down below was closed. I don't know why it was closed, but it was closed. I opened it up. Didn't seem to be anybody there, so I went down. But there was a very vulnerable moment there, because bottom first, with both hands on the ladder, vertical ladder, revolver holstered, and I was a sitting target for anybody down below. I looked both ends of the ship. You could see right through to the battery room, the engine room, and then up forward to the torpedo compartments. And didn't seem to be anybody on board at all. Very eerie, absolute silence except for the flopping of the waves against the hull. So I then shouted up, got the crew down, and then we started ransacking the place. All the books and the charts and absolute mess of code books, signal books, cipher books, everything we could find. We passed up and into a relief boat. Captain had sent a motorboat over from a Broadway, and that took all the gear.
But what happened to Lemp, last seen by his crew in the water? It's widely believed he tried to reboard his U-boat in a desperate effort to sink it, and was shot by the boarding party from Bulldog.
I know from time to time it's said that my boarding party shot Lemp. There's absolutely no truth whatsoever in this. None of us fired a single shot. And we didn't see the survivors. They'd been picked up or were being picked up the other side of the U-boat. And I think Lemp must have realized that the U-boat wasn't sinking. He may have seen us going over in the boat. And thinking of his past too, when he'd sunk the Athenia, which was quite a controversial matter. And I think he probably felt this is really it, letting my boat be boarded, not sinking it. And he probably just committed suicide in the water.
David's cryptographic treasures from U-110 were rushed to Bletchley, and together with the seizures from the weather ships, the code breakers were now able to crack the Enigma ciphers. It was one of the outstanding achievements of World War II. The British were soon reading the secret messages that passed between Dönitz and his U-boats as rapidly as the Germans themselves.
We began to read regularly the U-boat ciphers, and we read it without fail every day. The use of the Enigma, the fact that it was so regular, so current, meant that we were more or less able to route the convoys away from U-boat positions.
The pendulum in the Battle of the Atlantic had swung for the moment in Britain's favor. By mid-1941, the convoys were getting through with reduced losses, and the United States, though technically still neutral, was playing an ever-increasing role in ensuring those vital war supplies reached British shores.
We were in the war against the German U-boats, helping England long before the United States technically declared war. I know I was there. I was in a destroyer. We convoyed across the Atlantic Ocean. We escorted across all the way to Iceland from the United States. Some of our fellows escorted all the way to within 100 miles of the shore of England.
By placing United States naval vessels in the convoy lanes and directly protecting the ships, the freighters and the tankers that were carrying goods to Great Britain, the United States was engaged in warlike activity.
So we were in action. Our orders were to fight back. President Roosevelt declared first that everything on a certain line in the middle of the Atlantic was on our side. Later he extended that line closer to Europe and finally declared the entire Atlantic Ocean an American lake.
It must be said that most people then and most people now do not know that the United States issued war orders in July of 1941, 6 months before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The orders were issued by Admiral Ernest J. King, who was Commander-in-Chief of the United States Atlantic Fleet. This was a direct action for the United States Navy to go to war. On September 4th, a destroyer, the USS Greer, had an exchange of fire with a U-boat at sea. Both missed. There was no damage done to either side, but the exchange of fire that everybody had worried about had taken place.
The following month, the destroyer Kearney was torpedoed and 11 seamen died. American blood had joined the Atlantic War.
Our American merchant ships must be armed to defend themselves against the rattlesnakes of the sea.
Even as Roosevelt spoke, one of those rattlesnakes, U-552, was hunting its prey in the Atlantic.
Our American merchant ships must be free to carry our American goods into the harbors of our friends.
In command of U-552 was Erich Topp, one of Donitz's greatest aces.
And our American merchant ships must be protected by our American Navy. It can never be doubted that the goods will be delivered by this nation, whose Navy believes in the tradition of damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead.
4 days after Roosevelt's speech, Topp torpedoed the American destroyer Reuben James. It was the first U.S. Navy vessel to be lost in World War II. 2/3 of the ship's company died.
As far as I was concerned, the Reuben James was a British destroyer protecting a British convoy. And therefore, I had no qualms about attacking her. Several days later, I heard on American radio that an American destroyer, the Reuben James, had been sunk. And I realized just how politically explosive this matter was. 110 lives were lost in this catastrophe. And you could say they were murdered in the most horrific way imaginable. People were swimming around in oil, on fire. It was appalling. At least 2/3 of the crew. I was haunted by this image, and I spent days and nights thinking about it, unable to change what had happened. From my point of view, I felt guilty that I might have started a war with the Americans.
Topp did not, but the Japanese did. Out of the blue Hawaiian skies, 5 weeks later, they rained devastation on the American battle fleet at Pearl Harbor, sinking or seriously damaging 18 ships and killing over 2,000.
Overnight, after December 7, 1941, the entire American nation rose up in wrath against the Japanese. But there was no commitment in Congress to declare war against Nazi Germany. It took Germany to declare war on us to bring us into war with that power. And many people think that next to Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, this was his biggest mistake. On December 11th, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler unilaterally, gratuitously, with no sound reason, declared war against the United States.
But that declaration of war against the USA, far from creating despondency in the U-boat arm, was celebrated.
There was great elation in the German Navy because for months they had had to fight with an arm tied behind their back against the American destroyers that were escorting British convoys across the Atlantic east and west. Now, the commanders were free to launch torpedoes at every warship they saw in the Atlantic. There was no holding back because of the Americans. Dönitz secured permission from Hitler to go ahead and plan an attack along the east shore of the United States, from Maine to Florida, in an operation that Dönitz called Paukenschlag, drumbeat. Now, Admiral Dönitz thought that his U-boats would have no problem with the United States Navy because they were untrained and unprepared, and in Dönitz's view, and certainly that of Hitler too, the United States Navy was unprofessional. The German High Command had a very poor regard for the American fighting man. Did not think that the American had the stomach for a fight. Did not think that the Americans would be able effectively to turn back those U-boats, to bloody their noses. Rather thought that the U-boats would bloody the American Navy's noses. And they were right. It was the greatest maritime disaster in modern times. It was the greatest defeat at sea suffered by the United States Navy in World War II. It was an Atlantic Pearl Harbor.
The German submarine commander believed it was really the only way of bringing Britain to its knees. To start with, it was just a question of sinking as much as it possibly could. Dönitz and his statisticians came to the conclusion that by sinking about 600,000 tons of ships a month, and that works out at roughly 100, 150 ships a month, they could probably cut the British supply line.
After World War I, the German Navy effectively ceased to exist. They had only begun to rebuild the Navy in the 30s, once Hitler came to power. But at the time war broke out, they really lacked anything like the kind of resources necessary to fight a war with Great Britain. Dönitz had said, if we have war with Britain, give me 300 U-boats and I'll be able to beat her. When war broke out, he had 57 boats.
These U-boats were already deployed in waters around Britain. It was Dönitz's first move towards severing those vital supply lines with North America. The threat of war hung heavily over Britain, and Americans living there were urged to return home. On September the 3rd, 1939, a few hours before the British declared war on Germany, a passenger ship, the Athenia, sailed from Liverpool for North America. One of the last passengers to board was Kathleen Scher.
I didn't want to leave England. I hated the prospect of the thought that we were going to be in another world war, and yet it seemed inevitable that it was coming.
The Athenia's 1,400 passengers were unaware a U-boat was stalking their liner along the coast of Ireland. Its commander was Fritz Julius Lemp. International rules of engagement forbade him from sinking a civilian ship without first allowing those on board to take to the lifeboats. This ruling did not apply to enemy warships.
He thought that there were camouflage cannon on the ship, and therefore assumed he had a troop ship in front of him. And as a result, he thought an attack was justified.
I was at dinner. I had been invited by a ship's officer to sit at his table.
I wanted to experience the first torpedo attack of the war for real. The first shot came smoothly out of the tube, and after a short while came the detonation.
There was this incredible, absolutely incredible explosion, everything went pitch black, a lot of screaming, a lot of yelling.
Only when we tuned into the merchant shipping frequency in the radio room and received the distress call did we realize that it was the Athenia with 1,400 passengers on board. But by then it was too late.
Ships responded to the Athenia's SOS messages. Kathleen was in an open lifeboat for 9 hours before being rescued.
I remember watching the Athenia turn turtle, and this great hulk rose up into the air and then went down.
Kathleen was lucky. 118 passengers perished, 28 were US citizens. There was international outrage as survivors disembarked in North America. When Lemp returned to Germany, he was secretly ordered to forge his patrol log, removing any reference to the Athenia. This defied every naval convention.
Lemp.
The port of Lorient, Brittany, on the southwest coast of France. Today, a peaceful haven. During World War II, these concrete pens housed one of the most deadly military machines ever created, the Unterseeboot, the German U-boat. From here, U-boats sailed to every corner of the world, wreaking havoc and destruction. Their prime objective, sinking merchant shipping in the Atlantic. U-boats were active from the first day of the war to the last. They posed the greatest threat of all to Allied victory in World War II. The central control room of a Type 7C U-boat, the most prolific of all U-boats. 650 were built. This is the only fully equipped example remaining today. Inside this deadly fighting machine, 44 crew members lived alongside their weapons of war for days on end in cramped and often squalid conditions. 40,000 men went to war in these machines in World War II. 30,000 were to die in their iron coffins. They suffered the highest mortality rate of any fighting unit in the history of war. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill later wrote, "The threat the U-boats posed in the Atlantic was the only thing that ever really frightened me during the war. On their defeat hung the outcome of World War II."
The Battle of the Atlantic was unique in terms of naval operations. What it really was a 6-year struggle for control of the sea lines of communications between North America and Great Britain.
This is the man who created and directed Germany's U-boat fleet in World War II. Admiral Karl Dönitz believed that Britain could be defeated by severing those lines of communication. His U-boats would do that by sinking the vessels that brought the vital supplies on which Britain, an island nation, depended for her survival. This was a war about tonnage.
Dönitz,